Assalamu alaikum and a very good day to all the viewers tuning in. My name is Niran Rahman, Chief Business Officer, Dun & Bradstreet, Pakistan. Welcoming you to a deep dive in Pakistan's Consumer Confidence Index 2021. For over 180 years, Dun & Bradstreet has been helping our customers and partners accelerate growth and improve business performance via data and analytics. Our DNB Data Cloud offers the world's most comprehensive data and analytics tools covering over 450 million commercial records. DNB has a presence in over 200 countries, including Pakistan. I'm joined by Mr. Numan Lakhani, CEO, Dun & Bradstreet, Pakistan. And very warm welcome to you, Numan. Thank you for joining us at this event to deep dive into Pakistan's Consumer Confidence Index.
Alaikum, and thank you for having us.
So DNB Pakistan has also partnered with Gallup Pakistan. Gallup Pakistan is Pakistan's oldest survey and opinion research institute, an affiliate of Gallup International Association. The organization brought the science of polling to Pakistan in 1980. Currently, Gallup provides data and analytics and public policy decision-making support to national and international clients. Bilal Ijaz is the Executive Director of Gallup Pakistan. He has a master's from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and has been heading Gallup for around a decade. He joins us today as well. Bilal, welcome to this event. We are deep diving into Pakistan's Consumer Confidence Index, a partnership between your institution and ours. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, and very glad to be on this platform.
So let's start with Numan. Numan, what is the Consumer Confidence Index? What made you introduce it in the Pakistan market?
Thank you for that, Niran. So I think let's first of all define what the Consumer Confidence Index is. As viewers can see it on the screen as well, it's the consumer sentiments are volatile and they're shaped largely by consumers' perception about, let's say, the economic performance of a country. So the Consumer Confidence Index is a global phenomenon. It's not Pakistan introduced. It's something that happens across the world. And it's an instrument or an index that serves as a leading indicator for households, consumptions, and savings, which plays a pivotal role in the overall economic activity. Now, introducing CCI in Pakistan was in line with launching various knowledge products in the country since we started our operations about 3 years ago. We introduced weekly newsletters. We introduced one for, let's say, economic and a business bulletin that goes out every week. We do a specially designed newsletter for the banking side that goes out to all the bankers in the country. Then we went out to introduce Business Optimism Index, which is again a global product, publication for Dun & Bradstreet. And then very closely, right after that, we introduced the Consumer Confidence Index in collaboration with Gallup. Our intention was to launch these two separate indices, one to measure the business pulse and the other for consumers. What would remain in the middle is the government policies and performance. Thereon, basically, our thought was that in the coming few months and years, with such indices in place, such as the CCI and the BOI, they will become the barometer to predict what lies ahead for the nation in the coming 3 to 6 months. But these are obviously early days, and of the 8 quarters that we've started this publication, we have a long way to go to be able to get there. But our intention is to create a publication such as this.
Excellent. Bilal, who is this index meant for? And how should our viewers read it?
Thank you so much. This is an excellent question. I think the main audiences for Consumer Confidence Index that's produced worldwide, and I think it's true for here in Pakistan as well, are primarily the government of Pakistan, the private sector, manufacturing services, and trade organizations who are working in Pakistan, and then generally the stakeholders around these, including the media. All of these three different stakeholders, they want to understand what exactly is happening with the consumer. A happy consumer for them is a good news. A pessimistic consumer is a bad news, because a happy consumer spends, a pessimistic consumer saves and shies away from spending. And we wanted to ensure that the Consumer Confidence Index was able to serve all of these three different stakeholders. And therefore, the report and and the way it's structured, the way it's disseminated, the way it's presented, is essentially catered to all of these three different audiences within the country.
Okay, excellent. Numan, very well summed up by Bilal on who should be reading this index. Anything to add with respect to the audience for our viewers? Maybe it's policymakers, but more importantly, जो पाकिस्तान का जो आम आदमी है, वो इस इंडेक्स के नताइज से क्या सीख सकता है?
So consumer confidence index, इसको बड़ा easily अगर देखें और simple तरीके से देखें तो एक ऐसा सर्वे है जो कि जानना चाहता है कि एक एवरेज पाकिस्तानी कितना पूरी उम्मीद है और अपने मुल्क की माशी हालात के बारे में क्या राय रखता है, घरेलू माली हालात के बारे में क्या उसकी राय है, इक्तिसादी हालात, आगे जाके उसकी नौकरी या उसकी मुलाजमत के इम्कानात कितने बढ़ रहे हैं या कम हो रहे हैं. सो ये जो सर्वे है ये सार्फिन को के रद्दो अमल को जानने की कोशिश करता है कि ये सब चीजें वो मालूमात कर सके और पिछला 3 से 5 महीने 6 महीने कैसे गुजरे और अगले 3 से 5 से 6 महीने वो कैसा देख रहा है अलग अलग तरीके कार से. सो अगर ये सिंपली मेरे हिसाब से इसको अगर देखा जाए तो ये सबसे आसान तरीका देखने का इसको.
बिल्कुल सही. बिलाल, आप कुछ ऐड करना चाहेंगे? एक आम शहरी पाकिस्तान का जो अपने माशी हालात पर एक गहरी नजर रखना चाहता है, ये इंडेक्स और इस इंडेक्स के नताइज उसके लिए क्या फायदेमंद है? क्या इस नंबर से, इस इंडेक्स नंबर से उसको कोई फायदा नजर आ सकता है फॉर मे बी फ्यूचर बजटिंग?
बिल्कुल. सो आई थिंक एक जो चीज पाकिस्तान के बारे में इम्पोर्टेंट है वो ये कि पाकिस्तान एक बहुत बड़ा मुल्क है. यानी हम जैसे सिर्फ और 5 मुल्क ऐसे हैं जो आबादी के लिहाज से इतने बड़े हों. तो इतने बड़े मुल्क के बारे में कोई राय देना कि इकोनॉमी कैसी जा रही है, लोगों के हालात कैसे जा रहे हैं, इसके ऊपर कोई साइंस ही हमें बता सकती है कि कैसे ऐसा किया जा सके. क्योंकि किसी एक शख्स के लिए इतने बड़े मुल्क के बारे में कोई राय पेश करना या कोई उसके बारे में अदराक होना उस शख्स को, वो बहुत नामुमकिन है. तो सर्वे की जो साइंस है वो हमें एक स्नैपशॉट सा प्रोवाइड कर देती है कि एक with an error margin of this much percent we can say कि that's how the household economy looks like, that's how Pakistan's economy look like. तो एक आई थिंक आम पाकिस्तानी जो है वो जब टीवी टॉक शोज के ऊपर एनालिस्ट्स की बात सुनता है या एंकर्स की बात सुनता है या पॉलिटिशियंस की बात सुनता है तो उसके पास एक इंडिपेंडेंट राय भी मौजूद होनी चाहिए जो कि साइंटिफिकली उस जैसे और बाकी पाकिस्तानियों की हालात को नापने का, जांचने का कोई इंडिपेंडेंट बैरोमीटर पेश करें. तो आम पाकिस्तानी के लिए एक इंडिपेंडेंट बैरोमीटर के तौर पे भी एक है कि वो अगर किसी पे एतमाद कर सकते हो जिसका कोई वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, एक थर्ड पार्टी के तौर पर एक खुलासा सा पेश किया जाए, तो आई थिंक दैट इज अ कंट्रीब्यूशन दैट इज CCI इज डूइंग.
बिल्कुल सही है. आपने जो जिस बात का इशारा किया, मेरा दूसरा सवाल इसी तरफ ही आ रहा था. Who has this survey been conducted with? And इस सर्वे की एग्जीक्यूशन के बाद क्या जो फाइंडिंग्स हैं, क्या ऑनेस्टली बताइएगा क्या हमारी फाइंडिंग्स रेलेवेंट हैं? पहले तो ये बताइएगा कि सर्वे किसके साथ कंडक्ट किया हमने और फाइंडिंग्स रेलेवेंट है कि नहीं.
So, जो कंज्यूमर कॉन्फिडेंस इंडेक्स है, आई थिंक एक बात जो नुमान ने भी जिसकी तरफ इशारा किया वो ये कि कंज्यूमर कॉन्फिडेंस इंडेक्स जो है वो एक ग्लोबल फिनोमिना है, एक ग्लोबल इंडेक्स है. तो ये 1960s में एक कॉन्फ्रेंस बोर्ड के नाम से एक इंस्टीट्यूशन है US में. उन्होंने जैसे पाकिस्तान एक बड़ा मुल्क है, अमेरिका भी एक बहुत बड़ा मुल्क है, तो उन्होंने वहाँ पर ये साइंस इजाद की कि अगर हम कुछ सवालों की बेसिस के ऊपर, और वो कुछ सवाल एक नुमाइंदा सैंपल जिसको रिप्रेजेंटेटिव सैंपल पूछा जाता है, अगर हम उनके सामने वो सवाल रखते और वहाँ से हम फिर उसके ऊपर एक साइंटिफिक एनालिसिस करें, तो क्या हम इकोनॉमी की मौजूदा हालत और इकोनॉमी की आने वाले हालात को प्रिडिक्ट कर सकते हैं. تو کانفرنس بورڈ نے یہ کچھ سوال بنائے, پھر انہوں نے اس کے اوپر بہت سی ایکسپیریمنٹیشن کی, اور پھر جو سوال آج ہم سی سی آئی پاکستان میں پوچھتے ہیں یہ وہ ہیں کہ جو امریکہ میں ٹیسٹ ہوئے, پھر اور بہت سے ملکوں میں ٹیسٹ ہوئے, اور دیکھا یہ گیا کہ وہ نہ صرف موجودہ حالات اکانومی کے بلکہ آنے والے حالات کو اچھا پریڈکٹ کر پاتے ہیں. کچھ ملکوں میں ایکسپیریمنٹ ہوا کہ سی سی آئی جب اوپر جا رہی تھی تو اس سے کچھ ہی عرصے کے بعد جی ڈی پی کی گروتھ پہ بھی اضافہ دیکھا گیا. سی سی آئی کے نیچے آنے کے بعد کچھ ہی عرصے بعد جی ڈی پی بھی نیچے آتی نظر آئی, تو سی سی آئی کو ایک فور کاسٹنگ کے طور پہ لیا گیا. تو پہلی چیز تو یہ کہ یہ سوالات جو ہم یوز کر رہے ہیں یہ ایک انٹرنیشنل فریم ورک ہے, انٹرنیشنلی ٹیسٹڈ ہے, اور کمپیریٹیو پکچر بھی پرووائڈ کرتے ہیں کہ پاکستان کا سی سی آئی اوپر جا رہا ہے تو انڈیا کا سی سی آئی نیچے جا رہا ہے, تو یہ اسینشلی براڈلی سملر فریم ورکس کو یوز کر کے. دوسری چیز یہ کہ اب ہم سوال اگر ہم نے طے کر لیے, ان کو ہم نے جانچ لیا کہ یہ سوال واقعی یوزفل ہیں, تو اب سوال پوچھے کس سے جائیں. تو یہ کیونکہ کنزیومرز کا جیسے نام میں لکھا گیا ہے کنزیومر کانفیڈنس کا ایک سروے ہے, تو کنزیومرز جو ہیں عام پاکستان میں 18 سال سے بڑی عمر کے افراد, ان کو ہم لیگلی کیونکہ سروے کر سکتے ہیں, تو اس میں عام پاکستانی جو 18 سال سے بڑی عمر کا ہے چاہے وہ کہیں بھی رہتا ہے, وہ اس سروے کے لیے ایک ایلیجبل ہے اس سروے میں پارٹیسپیٹ کرنے کے لیے. اور جو ہمارا طریقہ ہے سروے کو کرنے کا وہ ایک فون بیسڈ سروے جو کہ رینڈم ڈیجٹ ڈائلنگ کے تھرو کیا جاتا ہے, which basically means that there are about 120 million adults who are above the age of 18 in Pakistan. Almost 90% of them have a mobile phone. تو آپ سمجھیں کہ 110 ملین پاکستانی 120 میں سے ہمارے سروے میں آنے کی پروبیبلٹی رکھتے ہیں, اور ایکول پروبیبلٹی رکھتے ہیں. وہ جب ہم یوزولی سروے کرتے ہیں, آپ نے Q4 کی رپورٹ سامنے رکھی ہوئی ہے, تو اس میں تقریباً 150 ڈسٹرکٹس پاکستان میں ہیں. وہ 150 کے 150 ہمارے سروے میں ریپرزینٹیڈ ہیں. وہاں سے چاگی میں بھی کوئی ہے, کوئی ہنزا میں ہے, کوئی تھر پارکر کے ڈیزرٹ میں ہے. اسی طرح سے اس میں اربن اور رورل علاقے بھی شامل ہیں. تو کیونکہ پاکستان جو ہے وہ ایک دیہی ایک طرح کا ملک ہے, تو ابھی بھی 50% سے زیادہ عوام جو ہے وہ ایک ڈیپلی رورل علاقے میں رہتی ہے, اور 50% جو ہے وہ اربن میں رہتی ہے. ان 50% جو اربن میں رہتے ہیں ان میں سے میرے اور آپ کی طرح تقریباً 1/4 اربن کراچی, لاہور اور اسلام آباد جیسے میٹروپولیٹن میں رہتے ہیں. تو اسی تناسب سے اس سروے کے اندر ان کو بھی لے لیا گیا ہے تاکہ ایسا نہ ہو کہ ہم رورل کو یا اربن کو کم آواز دے سکیں. اس میں مرد بھی ہیں اور خواتین بھی ہیں, کیونکہ مرد اور خواتین دونوں ہی کنزیومر ہیں. جب ہم سوال لوگوں سے پوچھتے ہیں کہ گھر کی شاپنگ کون کرتا ہے, تو گھر کی شاپنگ میں ایک دلچسپ جواب آتا ہے, وہ یہ کہ فیصلہ جو ہے وہ 80% آف دا ٹائم خواتین کرتی ہیں, اور 80% آف دا ٹائم جو ہے وہ مرد جو ہیں وہ پہ جا کے ایونچولی اس ڈیسیجن کو فلفل کرتے ہیں. تو یہ ایک پہیے کی طرح ہے کہ جو ہاؤس ہولڈ کنزیومر ڈیسیجن ہے, تو اس لیے ہم مرد اور خواتین دونوں کو اس میں شامل کرتے ہیں. تو ایک میں اختتام کروں گا اس بات سے کہ اسینشلی ہم چاہتے یہ ہیں کہ ایک نمائندہ سیمپل چوز ہو جائے جس میں ایک ایوریج پاکستانی اس کو ہم اپنے سروے میں لے سکیں, اور اس ایوریج پاکستانی سے ہم یہ 5 یا 6 سوالات ہیں وہ ہم پوچھ سکیں, اور اس سے ہم اندازہ لگا سکیں کہ اس وقت کنزیومر کی جو موڈ ہے, کنزیومر کا ایٹیچیوڈ ہے, کنزیومر کا بیہیویئر ہے, اس کو ہم کیسے پریڈکٹ کر سکتے ہیں. آئی تھنک ایک چیز اس میں امپورٹنٹ ہے کہ کنزیومر کا کوئی کیوں اس میں چوز کیا جاتا ہے. تو اگر آپ جی ڈی پی کی کمپوزیشن دیکھیں تو اوور 80% آف جی ڈی پی ان پاکستان وہ کنزیومر کی اسپینڈنگ سے ڈٹرمن ہوتی ہے. سو اس لیے بھی کنزیومر کی اسپینڈنگ کو جانچنا جو ہے وہ ضروری ہے, کیونکہ کنزیومر جو ہے وہ پاکستان کی جی ڈی پی کا 80% کا ایک طرح سے ڈائریکشن ڈٹرمن کرتا ہے.
बिल्कुल सही और जैसे आपने पहले इशारा किया था that the consumption is directly linked to the future outlook and growth of the GDP, which is extremely interesting, and that is proven that the consumption patterns have to go up for future GDP forecasting to not only be conducive but also forecasted and increased. So I'm very happy that we've discussed the science behind the results, but let's now talk about the results themselves. And I'd like Naman to jump in and tell us about what we have learned from the consumer, the CCI, and consumption patterns over the last 2 years. So, let's move away from the science now and talk about the results. Naman, what are we seeing on our screens right now?
Absolutely. So before we dive into that, and while our viewers are looking at this piece of information over the last 2 years, as we've completed our 8 quarters of data being pulled in Pakistan and represented the way it is, a little bit of a backstory just to make this discussion a little interesting. So the first survey that was completed was done right before COVID-19 pandemic hit. And, so we halted taking out the report and issued the first 2 reports, the first 2 quarters together. And so that's just one piece of information that that I'd like to add for our viewers. In all the 8 quarters that the viewers can see on the screen, we've taken out the report. The overall index has been below the 100 net indicator value, which is a neutral value. So just to understand this better, the scores between 0 to 99 indicate a decreasing level of pessimism. With a score between 75 to 99, as a scheme would represent, is pessimistic. So anything under 75 is extremely pessimistic, but thankfully that is not the case here. And the scores between 101 and 200, above the 100 neutral value, indicates increasing level of optimism. So as we can clearly see that the highest point of the index was recorded in Q4 of 2020, which is exactly last year this time, which was recorded about 90.3. Over the past 2 years, consumers have consistently been more optimistic about the future outlook vis-a-vis the current situation, despite the COVID-19 related economic downturns. The depressions between the current situation and future outlook in 2021 is relatively lower, as you can see on the screen, than in the last year in 2020. Relative optimism witnessed a higher increase in Q2 of last year and peaked in Q3 of last year, due to lifting of the lockdown restriction, and the confidence generally rising, and the future outlook for 2021 was increasing. That is when we saw that spike there, and because of the restrictions of COVID-19 being lifted and the vaccination drive that was happening. But if you can see on an overall, I'll summarize by saying that for all 8 quarters or for 2 years consecutively, we have been under 100 value, which is a neutral value. And so that is one key element to notice. But there is a continuous spike going up and down depending on various conditions. That means that the consumers are reacting continuously. And if I go back and connect this to what Bilal was speaking of a little while ago, that this would eventually become a barometer of it predicting the inflation, the GDP, and other key economic indicators. And like if 80% of the GDP is generated by consumer demand, then this would naturally mean how the GDP is going to be performing in the coming quarter or 2. So I hope I've been able to explain it as simply as I can for our audiences.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, and this is stuff which we can tell our audience on the webinar rather than issue the report on what is the importance of these results. Bilal, you have anything to add on these results? I can see some mountainous formations, which means that consumption has been a bit volatile. The patterns have been a bit volatile, especially in the last 3 to 4 quarters compared to 2020. With some significant declines and then some recoveries as well. So it seems that the results in the last 2 to 3 quarters don't seem to be showing consistency, which means that there could be either some structural changes in consumption, one, or there could be mood patterns which might be due to some external influences rather than structural conditions. Any thoughts? on the volatility which we're seeing in the last 3 quarters?
Yeah. So if you look at the CCI, and if you break it down between the current and the future CCI, so as one can see, the CCI has two components. It is the consumer's confidence on the current state of things, and then the consumer's confidence in future. So if you look at the current state of how they explain their own economy, which is the household economy, and they explain how they view the country's economy, there is a relative bit of stability to that index. So it moves between, I mean, at least in the past few quarters, the fluctuations are significantly low. But if you look at the future expectations, which is also a more positive indicator, because it moves into the above 100 category, which essentially means that there are more people who are optimistic about how things are, and then there are pessimistic people. That has been is almost a sinusoidal wave which keeps on going up and then down, and I think that's to do with a lot to do with the external mood of the society, and primarily driven by COVID. So we did an exercise of looking at it, how the COVID waves and the government lockdowns are affecting this particular mood. And we see a significant correlation between how the consumer confidence is behaving with respect to how the COVID waves are coming and going, and the ensuing lockdowns that cripple the economy, and then eventually the consumer's confidence in it. So in some sense, the rocky movements here are essentially to do with COVID. And I think partly they also reflect that in the past 2.5 years, there have been signs that the economy may actually be able to break away from a lackluster performance, but then, and which drives up the consumer's confidence, especially about the future. But then what happens is a more gradual, a more slower than expected movement. So the GDP has been growing in these particular quarters, but the growth that was expected hasn't really come through. So the expectation was high. The eventual increase in people's consumer spending and their confidence in the system itself, that hasn't really happened. So you see a disjunction.
That could be, Bilal, and this is interesting that you're pointing it out. It could be that when the lockdowns ended, what might have happened was that inflation kicked in. These inflationary pressures came in due to some global supply chain gluts, and prices of oil and essential commodities, they increased. So that could be an external element, and I'd like Noman to comment on these external elements impacting confidence. Not just consumer confidence, but business confidence in general. And the two key indicators which impact consumer confidence are, one is inflation, because it's got a direct link with consumption. And two is unemployment. And that, when the unemployment numbers are increasing, that automatically dampens the confidence as well. So inflation and unemployment, these numbers, specifically inflation, which is issued by the regulator, the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, which directly links with our data as well. How does this external factor impact the results? Any thoughts, gentlemen, starting with Noman?
So I think probably while Bilal will be able to add much better in this view, but just to summarize from my perspective, and as I spoke about earlier as well, that from a pure results perspective of our CCI publication, it's evident for the last 2 years there has been pessimism which is geared towards a neutral value, right? And we see that swing that we just discussed a moment ago. The pandemic hasn't helped the cause either. In my view, it's been a tough few years for the consumers. The weakening rupee, high interest rates, and higher cost of living due to the fact that we're a net importing country, oil and its related products being the largest, probably the bill within the import. And since we are import dependent, then everything we buy becomes more expensive. The next few years, from my view, are going to be extremely testing for us as a nation to come out of this pandemic strong. External factors, as what are happening now, are spiking up the oil bill, amongst others. So I would say that these external factors combined are going to always keep impacting us as a nation and drive the consumers' demand, continuously changing quarter on quarter, depending on how the geopolitical environments are changing throughout the world.
Yeah, Bilal, I don't want to get into the political debate on why inflation is increasing in Pakistan. But the fact of the matter is, whatever the reasons are, it is increasing. And CPI is continuously going up. So, Bilal, this webinar, we're recording it at a time when the geopolitical situation, specifically in the West, is also dramatically changing. And that is changing on a daily basis. We are seeing prices of essential commodities going up, which means that our import bill, the price of our import bill, resulting in imported inflation, is going to increase. So, Bilal, do you feel that global and political developments have a direct impact on consumer confidence before the import bill and the current account deficit numbers come in? Do you think it impacts confidence directly and immediately, keeping in mind that the recent happenings in Ukraine and Russia and the recent prices which have gone up? Do you see that impacting the results in the next quarter?
Yeah. So I think there are two ways through which the external foreign events beyond the household's own economy affect the consumer's confidence about it. I think one is definitely that eventually when the inflation and unemployment comes in, that affects. But generally, also the consumer confidence is a measurement of consumers' psychology, and that psychology is certainly affected by what's happening around. And war anywhere in the world is a sign that affects consumers' expectation of what's going to happen in the future, because it essentially breaks the continuity that he or she was experiencing till that time. And I think one thing about Pakistan and the Pakistani consumer is that Pakistan is one of the highest labor exporting countries in the world. So when we look at household income, about 10% of households say that their income is directly dependent on someone sending money from abroad. But if you look at the more halo effect of this 10% and how many households or families that 10% of income is supporting, that's going to be at least twice.
I'm sorry to interrupt. That's a very interesting number. I just want you to reiterate that number for our viewers in case they didn't catch it. According to your experience, the polls which you conducted, what is the percentage of houses which are dependent on expat income? Could you just repeat that for my terminology?
Yeah. So for that, there are at least 10% households who say that their entire income is essentially based on someone working abroad and sending money at home. But at the same time, when someone sends money, that doesn't necessarily just affect the income and the expenditure of that particular household, but it has a halo effect because we Pakistanis live in a very complicated family situation in which it's not just a nuclear family, it's a biradari that essentially gets supported by someone sending money. So we typically, when we look at it, we multiply it by at least 2 or 3 other families also being dependent. So external events like what's happening in Ukraine, what happens to the oil price in the Gulf countries, if there is war in the Gulf countries, if there is war in the European territories, if there is war that affects containers, that affects supply routes, that affects flights for people not being able to go to Middle East and work there, people are sent back forcibly. That has a not just a psychological impact, but also a very direct income and expenditure impact. And therefore, I think the geopolitical environment that's not just psychologically affecting people, but it's also, I mean, for them, it's a loss that is coming their way eventually, one or the other way, and that's, I think, dampening down the sentiment about what's going to happen. So it's not just Ukraine, but it was true for COVID as well, when the Middle Eastern economy was badly affected, when people were coming back. It was a psychological effect as well as a direct impact effect that was happening. But at the same time, I think there are some good sides to it as well. With the depreciation of the Pakistani rupee, at least that much percentage of Pakistani households have been kind of shielded away from the inflationary impact, because their incomes have also risen by a certain proportion, as opposed to others who were only reliant on the domestic income. So I think that's a finer point that one gets to see, because a lot of people tell us that it's when you look at the economy, a lot of people have experienced just a downward hill, but for others, it's been a mixed picture. And I think the CCI is reflecting that. Therefore, it's not just a downhill, but it's also for some it's an upward hill. And
so coming to the results on our screen, Bilal, 16.3% overall, quarter on quarter, household savings have gone up. And is this illustration which you just very nicely pointed out? Is that so? Just to look at the results on the screen, I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the 16.3% increase is primarily because of the reason which you just pointed out, that because of the expat dependency, households, certain percentage of households in Pakistan have gotten a chance to save some money this time around. Would that be correct?
I think it is correct, and I think saving is also a means through which people are creating a safety net for themselves in the future. So in COVID, we were seeing that when incomes were declining or incomes that actually stopped, people were digging into their saving pots, and then once income start to rise, people start to replenish their savings and to keep it for those times, as well as when they fear that future is not going to be good, but present is fine, they start to raise up their savings. So one user of CCI across the world has been banks, who look at that particular household savings component of the CCI specifically, because it helps them forecast how much money people are eventually going to save in financial instruments. So I just to reiterate your point, I think this is a positive turn, that people have relative disposable income, which they are currently hoping that they could essentially save as well for a future time to spend.
Very interesting. So, I mean, the CCI, as a banker, not only does it measure the percentage of savings, where they can see what the demand for government securities are, but then they can also see what the demand for credit in the economy is. And more importantly, as we're talking, if it's also a catalyst for growth, which is the first indicator for growth, this will also help them possibly forecast monetary policy decisions by the regulator. So there are multiple advantages for a banker, an economist, to view these results in measuring the economy and trying to figure out which direction rates are going in the future as well. So that's all very interesting. Numan, Bilal pointed out something at the beginning of the webinar, an important point on the role of the female in the household in Pakistan, and the key decision makings of consumption within the household itself. And that's an extremely interesting point. This could be unique to Pakistan, or this could also be unique to South Asia, where the decision making within the household, has that had an impact on the result? And is there any specific distinction between the male consumption patterns and the female consumption patterns in terms of their confidence when we illustrate the results for our viewers for the year.
Yeah, so as the viewers can see on the screen, and on the right hand side of the screen, we're looking at the male and female responses to the survey, and you can look at the amount of males and females there, about 2,200 males versus about close to about an 800 number for females. And if you look at the comparison between Q3 and Q4, as it is evident that the males on an overall basis are a little more optimistic, are more confident as compared to the females here in this case. As you can see, the numbers on a net basis are about 79.3, which is a positive 11% jump over last quarter, versus females who are 71.1%, with still a positive impact in terms of 5%, but little less overall confident than males in terms of the overall confidence in as a consumer. We usually see that females save more, are in control of the financial situation, but this survey results are a little different. And if you see the future perspective as well, which is on the third line of each of the male and the female elements that you can see on the screen, from a future perspective also, the males were at 94.5%, which is very close to the neutral value and inching towards the more optimistic scenario. So we can see that incline there. And females are not far behind, and they see that future prospect better as well. But if you see the current situation, and if you compare both males and females, we're looking at females being very pessimistic at a 55% level, 55 number, whereas males are still a little higher at 64%. So, but surely markets and sentiments are driven by the female across the country, and the numbers in the surveys previously in the quarters have resulted something differently. In this case, it is something different, and that is the beauty of information and statistics, like Bilal mentioned towards the early part of our conversations, that science is the only thing that can help us understand the economy and the growth and anything that is happening. It is going to be these kind of analysis that are going to help us predict and understand how the economy is performing. This is, if I recall, about last year, maybe the numbers were inverse, where females were absolutely more optimistic than males, and which is not the case in the last 2 quarters.
Okay, so thanks for summarizing the results, and I want Bilal, because he touched upon it earlier, to discuss the psychology. The science is actually the result of the psychology, right, Bilal? And you touched on the point earlier, just to deep dive into the psychology, which resulted in these numbers. Any comments for our viewers?
So over the years, what we have seen there is that the females, because essentially they are the decision makers of the household's budget. So men earn, unfortunately, within the labor force, only a quarter of the women are in the labor force, whereas over 80% of the men are in labor force. But despite the fact that the 3/4 of the women who are not earning, they are able to, they are in a decision-making situation when it comes to the household's budget. So typically in a month's time, a household spends something like 45,000 rupees in a month, and it varies between rural and urban areas. In rural areas, it's lower. In urban areas, it's higher. So because the households sort of the key to the household.
लगता है आपके घर में सारी डिसीजंस भाभी लेती हैं, जैसे आप कर रहे हैं, लेकिन वो आई थिंक हम तीनों को पता चल गया है कि आपके घर में जो है ना who is making all the decisions? Yeah.
I
Sorry,
fully agree.
मैंने आपका thought process है मेरे
ये बात बिल्कुल दुरुस्त है आपकी. So because females are in this sort of very uncomfortable situation right now of managing the household budget with inflation as high as 20%. Because if you look at the sensitive price index, that is at 20%. The CPI is at 11% or 12%, but the sensitive price index, which is really what really hurts the household, that's at 20%. So over the years, the incomes have risen less, but the household expenditure has grown by 20%, not just because something has increased, but just because the prices have increased. So I think when I look at the females being pessimistic about the current and the future, I think it's primarily because it puts their job into a very, very difficult, tight spot where they have to put food in people's mouth without the comfort of the credit side being increased, and that it's the debit side that is continuously demanding more, whereas the credit side is not. So I would ascribe the male versus female, whereas female are more pessimistic, primarily because because of the inflation part. I think the rural urban is also somewhat similar. If you look at the rural CPI, the rural CPI is slightly lower now. The urban CPI is more, and therefore the urban areas are slightly more pessimistic, and the rural areas are less pessimistic. So that's my reading of how one can look into these numbers.
Interesting, extremely interesting, fascinating, actually. All very fascinating. And I hope some policymakers and key decision makers are taking a look at these results as we speak. And where do we go from here, Numan? We've discussed the current patterns. The main question, in some cases, the million-dollar question would be that where are we going? What is the direction which you see in 2022 and beyond?
So I think that's a million-dollar question that everybody is looking at. But while I would hope that our CCI, our joint CCI index that we've developed for Pakistan, is able to come to that level of maturity in the next couple of iterations that we do of this index quarter on quarter. But I think one way of positively looking at it is on what the household saving numbers were for last quarter, for Q4. And that is that 16.3% rise quarter on quarter, which is the greatest improvement again amongst all parameters of the survey. So we hope to see better levels of confidence among consumers backed by sound government policies and performance. The overall economy numbers are looking quite positive towards the end of the year. And that can be seen based on possibly highest ever export numbers for the country, highest level of revenue collection potentially for the country since its inception, highest remittances being recorded, freelancers being in the IT industry being documented and facilitated, the Prime Minister launching the SME policy a couple of days ago, the IT industry is booming. All these signs are leaning towards a positivity. If we just talk about the positives, I feel they, at this point in time, overweigh all the problems that we might be facing as a nation. And it gives us the hope to expect that something positive is coming out and optimism or confidence is to increase in the next couple of quarters going forward as well.
Excellent. So I'm happy that we're closing it on a positive note. Bilal, I'm hoping that you also close it on a positive note. With the global supply chain, firstly, with the global supply chain problem, there are structural issues in Pakistan. We are all aware of them, specifically on the economic side. But the numbers, specifically the export numbers, the remittances numbers, and the tax collection numbers seem to be in the right direction. And with all the points which Numan just mentioned, Bilal, I am also hoping that you are looking at an increase in confidence for the upcoming year 2022?
I agree. I'd start with this, that the Pakistani population, we are a very battle-hardened country. And therefore the consumer is looking for very small signs of improvement for his confidence or her confidence to improve in the economy. And I do hope, and I do see signs that in the next 1.5 year, before this political government is able to close its economic agenda, I think things are going to improve. We already see an uptick in large scale manufacturing. We also see improvement in significant improvement in exports that had been stuck for almost 2 decades. So we see a needle moving in that direction. And I think when large scale manufacturing and exporting moves, the industries providing as vendors to these particular large scale manufacturing and exporters, they also eventually get that effect showing in their books as well. So I think there is a lot of room for optimism here.
That's interesting, because the synergy between Gallup and Dun & Bradstreet, what's also important is documentation for us. You as data collectors, we as third-party business verifiers, and play a key role in as a third party mitigating credit risk and providing marketing solutions for both organizations, both Gallup and Dun & Bradstreet Pakistan. Documentation is extremely important, and I believe there are some strides being made with respect to that. The recent IT policy, the FBR has taken certain initiatives to make sure documentation is increased. So just Raman's thoughts before leaving on documentation, verification, and ensuring that the more our economy is documented, the better chances we have of portraying and illustrating the correct picture of what is actually going on in Pakistan.
That's a beautiful way to end the conversation. I think it's music to the ears of probably any government to bring documentation and transparency into the entire ecosystem. And that is how players such as Gallup and Dun & Bradstreet bring value to the table, and whereby we are looking at these pieces of information, collating it together and bringing more sense out of it for it to be utilized by various organizations and businesses and individuals, not just in Pakistan, but worldwide. You're absolutely right. The documentation is the key to progress. That is something that Dun & Bradstreet, if I talk about our institution, and Bilal can probably contribute after me, is the fact that we've seen economic growth as Dun & Bradstreet across the world, where businesses start to provide information, are being more transparent, are telling third parties more about themselves. It helps to build that confidence and transparency for the international third parties looking at, for example, in this case, Pakistani businesses, and to understand them better, to trust them better, to look at them in a more positive light. And then it is up to organizations such as us on this call today to portray and use that information to the best of our ability, to be used more intelligently by our users, our clients globally, and also in Pakistan.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Absolutely. Bilal, this is a survey conducted by a third party, which is Dun & Bradstreet and Gallup. So the science behind it is, it's at a global standard. And third-party surveys and third-party documentation and third-party results and third-party service providers seem to be the way to go as far as documenting the economy. Do you have any thoughts with respect to this? And then maybe we can leave this as a food for thought for our viewers, especially the policymakers and the business-minded people who are looking to expand globally.
I fully agree. I think Pakistan and other developing economies, they have a huge potential, but sometimes that potential is undervalued and underappreciated because there is either no third-party verification of what's really happening on the ground, or the businesses do not have documented proof of how well they're doing. And I think by the CCI, we're bringing that third-party evaluation of where the economy really is and where the consumers think it is. And by your initiative of documenting and providing the verifiable proof of exactly how the business is performing, you really bring Pakistani businesses to the international platforms and make them available for investment, which is a win-win solution because Pakistan is a very large market. We've had issues with how we have been able to project Pakistan. And I think international organizations like yourself can bring that validity after having done very thorough and professional work on those organizations. So I think documentation is really going to solve Pakistan's problems.
Yeah. Absolutely, Bilal, and thank you so much for joining us on this event, and thank you for your in-depth analysis on the Consumer Confidence Index. Mr. Numan Lakhani is the CEO of Dun & Bradstreet Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us on this at this event as well. If you would like to know more about the Consumer Confidence Index in Pakistan, please visit Dun & Bradstreet Pakistan's LinkedIn page. Like it. The entire report is available there. It is public information. And we've just shown you a little bit of the results. The report is quite comprehensive and is readily available on Dun & Bradstreet Pakistan's LinkedIn page. So do like that page to know more about not only the happenings in Pakistan's economy, but about Dun & Bradstreet and what we're actually up to in Pakistan. Once again, thank you, gentlemen, for joining this webinar, and hopefully we can do this again very, very soon. And thank you for all our viewers who have tuned in. And your feedback is extremely important. The feedback, please do share questions, feedback, comments on the link below. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having us. Take care. Thank you, Bilal, for being on the call with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.